Welcome, everyone. You're listening to a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast on Mental Health News Radio Network. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Lorilee Binstock, host of a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast on Mental Health News Radio Network and anywhere you get your podcast. Today's guest is Cody Peterson, a recovering alcoholic and drug addict with over 11 years clean and sober. Cody just released a new book, The Shadow of a Figure of Light, the Archetype of the Alcoholic and the Journey to Enlightenment. It delves into the nature of modern psycho-spiritual transformation by examining the human thirst for wholeness through the lens of alcoholism and addiction. Cody, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
There's a lot to kind of unpack with your title. Could you actually talk a little bit about your book and why you chose the title?
Yeah, the title comes from it's kind of a Jungian idea from Carl Jung, the great Swiss psychiatrist. And the title refers to kind of this thing that he would call the conjunction of the opposites, which is sort of like it's like a mystical kind of spiritual idea that it's about sort of conjoining the opposites of our own nature, right? Our sort of highest kind of religious spiritual experiences with what he would call our lowest and most depraved secrets. And so kind of what it refers to then is, if there's it even kind of refers to the nature of, the God image and spirituality in general, that even the best of us and even the best of our experiences are sort of burdened by a shadow complex. And that the best thing we can do really for ourselves as well as for the world is to make our shadow conscious, or to become conscious of the shadow. So that's kind of what it refers to in a nutshell.
What made you want to write the book?
I've always wanted to write a book ever since I was a kid. When I was young, I was really interested in kind of sort of like Christian ideas. I would read these really heady books that were kind of commentary on the Bible, but I'm not a Christian anymore. I'm not a practicing Christian, but over the years, I always kind of, retained this interest, I guess, in spirituality and mysticism. And about 5 years ago, I started writing, and I started writing some poetry, and I started reading Carl Jung, and then yeah, what happened was it's the weirdest thing. I wrote this like really kind of interesting, cool poem, I guess, about the shadow of a figure of light, and then I started writing a lot right after that. And what kind of emerged over the next 3 or 4 years was this book. So it's really been an interesting process, I guess. I don't know what I mean. I feel like the book was pretty inspired, at least for me. Whether it inspires those people who read it, we're yet to see. But it's certainly been inspiring for me to write it, because it describes this. It's a conversation that I've really wanted to have. It's the conversation I long to have with the people who I'm close with, which often they're unable to meet me there, but so, I just decided, well, I can have this conversation in a much kind of broader sense and just put it out there to the world. So, yeah.
Did you find spirituality? You said you've been 11 years sober. Am I correct? Okay. Did you find spirituality immediately after, or was this like a success, or you were seeking it out, or how did you get to that point?
Sure. So I first was, I guess, introduced to spirituality when I was a teenager, because I grew up in an alcoholic home, and I was also sort of like this young kind of practicing, raging alcoholic drug addict. And So I sort of found some spiritual connection as a teenager, but I didn't stay clean, for the duration. I ended up relapsing and got arrested and went to jail and just ended up homeless actually in Vegas. And that was, 11 years ago. And so, but I always kind of maintained that spiritual connection. I always felt that it was important, um, even in the darkness of my addiction, I tried to bring as much awareness as I could to what was going on around me, and just tried to be as present as possible.
Yeah.
And so when I finally got clean and sober, 11 years ago, I sort of revisited the spirituality. I do practice within a 12-step program. So that is kind of a spiritual program, kind of a
Hmm.
spiritual slash psychological approach. And so that's been sort of brewing for a long time. The current sort of iteration of my spirituality would be very Jungian in nature, and that's kind of the basis of the book too. So the book explores the 12 steps through a Jungian lens,
Interesting.
and it breaks down the 12 steps as something of like a modern myth. And so I look at some of the concepts and the ideas in the steps as symbolic, and then I kind of can compare the steps then to sort of ancient myths like Christianity and some other ones. I'm familiar with Christianity, so that's really the one I compare it to a little bit. And so yeah, and what I found is with writing this book and practicing this sort of way, is a lot of things are really coming to light. Jung says that we should try to sort of adopt a symbolic approach to our life. So and that's what I did in this book, and what I'm trying to do now, with like dream interpretation and
Mm.
stuff like that. So it's been quite the journey.
So kind of dipping into your subconscious mind and like
Yeah,
really
exactly.
pulling all of that stuff out. I do want to talk about how did you come to realize how did you start your journey on sobriety and healing? And I don't know about what your concepts for, alcoholism and addiction, but I truly feel like it stems from some sort of trauma. And I don't know if you feel the same way? And if so, if what would you I mean, obviously you were just talking about like it was in your family, right?
Mm.
You experienced that in your family. Can you talk a little bit about that and how and then towards your journey to realize like, okay, things have to change.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, for me personally, and I think it's probably this way for a lot of people who end up being either alcoholic or drug addicts, that there is something sort of written into our DNA. It's almost like fate. For me, um, it seemed that alcohol and drugs were a method of coping
Mhm.
when I was a kid, and so it was kind of a natural thing for me to sort of pick up alcohol, and then the way it sort of works on me was I found it to be quite comforting and sort of a solution, right, rather than a problem. And I think that's
Mm,
sort of a
yeah,
defining characteristic of addiction, is that the person who's addicted sort of sees it as a solution to their problems rather than the cause of their problems.
right.
um, and I think, 12-step experience, I guess, would show us that while it's true that trauma may sometimes lead to addiction, it's not really, there's something else that's taking place, because it is possible to sort of resolve the trauma and still be addicted, I think.
Yeah.
And so what Jung tells us, is that addiction is more of sort of a longing for spiritual connection, right? And that at base, rather than sort of a traumatic response, addiction is more of like a metaphor, for a person's longing for union with God, which is, or for spiritual connection, or what he also called wholeness. And so
Mm.
I think the journey in recovery, for many people, especially in the 12 steps, um, is one of sort of trying to um, accept the addiction as part of the spiritual process, and then learn to kind of integrate those energies, or that sort of drive for wholeness into into kind of life, into real life. And so, it's very interesting. I think that people who, like, we see this in the 12 steps so often, is people who were once, criminals, and they've been to prison, and maybe they were car thieves or whatever. They were sort of driven to this kind of living a dark life. They come into the 12 steps and they get clean and sober, and then what they do is they become extremely disciplined in their spiritual approach to life, and they're helping people, and they're leading meetings, and they're trying to do as much as they can to help the community, and help other people get clean and sober. So there's sort of this, it's almost like a pendulum, that swings from one extreme almost over to the other. And on both sides, there's really at base is that longing for wholeness, that spiritual thirst.
Right. I talk to trauma survivors. Obviously, this is a trauma survivor thrivers podcast. And I
Mm,
talk to trauma survivors all the time, and I think it does come down to feeling whole, right? And a lot of the trauma survivors I've spoken to who've dealt with addiction, it is yearning for to feel whole, to feel healed. It's like it is a healing journey. Um and did you feel that for you, you've always you had a curiosity for spirituality? Um and once you became sober, you started incorporating that into your life
mhm.
and integrating that. What what did you do to get to that point? Was it just the 12 steps? Were there other modalities that you used and incorporated in your
Yeah, I love that question. So, my spiritual journey started out as a teenager. I was really kind of I was a practicing Christian, so I kind of bought into the Christian religion, and then I relapsed, and then kind of ended up, in jail, and then in jail I went into rehab, and while I was in rehab, I was introduced to the 12 steps, as well as a lot of kind of Eastern forms. So, but
Mm,
more of like the Western sort of iterations of those, like Eckhart Tolle and
mhm.
Wayne Dyer. And there's others too that are more modern now. Michael Singer, and a couple of guys like that. So that was something that I kind of leaned on pretty heavily, and until I finally um, got clean and sober 11 years ago. I continued to practice that stuff, but there was a big shift for me about 6 years ago when I started reading Joseph Campbell, and he was a great mythographer. He wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which was actually the book that inspired George Lucas to create the Star Wars series. So,
Interesting.
and he talks about sort of worldwide myths, ancient and modern, and sort of the similarities that exist in those. And Joseph Campbell said something interesting. He said that for him, highlighting books was a form of meditation. And I really liked that, because that was something that I felt that I could do, and it didn't require a lot of discipline from me. So I started highlighting his books and kind of writing notes. And then I started reading Carl Jung, and doing the same thing there, really just delving into quite a few of his collected works. And I wrote the kind of, I had this kind of method for writing notes in the margins of my books. And I liked that, because it kind of incorporated the whole sort of spectrum of my spiritual journey. That's what I love about Carl Jung, is he sort of incorporates all of it, right? It all kind of fits into his little container, I guess, if you will. But my book emerged out of those notes that I had written. in the footnotes of these other books. So
Mm.
so where I'm at today is, and that I really love, is that I've used the 12 steps, and they were very useful for me in sort of making my shadow conscious. But that's kind of morphed now to where I'm doing kind of some deeper work just in my own life, with a lot of dream work. I see a therapist. I still attend 12-step meetings, and I like to try to go and be supportive where I can and help other people. And my wife and I are doing couples therapy, which is really, really helpful. That's a good
Mhm.
way of making the shadow conscious, because we have these sort of unconscious reactions to each other.
Right.
We end up doing this dance, so we've kind of, we've gotten a lot better at communicating and helping each other sort of see where we're reacting rather than just responding, I guess. And so that's where I'm at today. It's really trying to, integrate these spiritual principles into every aspect of my life.
Yeah, yeah. Talk a little bit more about the shadow self because I feel like it's very powerful, right? It's like it's I know you mentioned like it's like I don't want to say it's bad, right? Nothing it's not bad, right?
Hmm.
But it's not it's a balance, right? Between like the yin and yang.
Hmm.
But I'm interested in talking about the shadow self because I feel like the people who can't get to their that transformation from healing to healing, it's because it's very scary to confront the shadow, right?
Hmm.
It can be very scary. Um how was that for you? For me, I'm a childhood sexual abuse survivor, and for me there was a point where I was like I can't get any lower than this. So I'm just gonna confront all of this really ugly stuff. Um, and honestly, I had a lot of help. I went through um a treatment facility for trauma, and once I was out, I did psychedelic assisted therapy, which really helped me delve into my subconscious because it's 95% of our behaviors are from our based from our subconscious. And so being able to understand was very powerful for me. Um, how were you in addressing your shadows? And obviously you were successful. Um, but what advice do you give to others trying to confront those demons?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and congratulations on doing that hard work,
Mhm.
right? It's I think confronting the unconscious and the shadow is like the scariest thing that we can do. And I mean, I think if we look around in our culture, it's pretty much the last thing that anyone wants to do, right? And I
Exactly.
think that it's so important to get to that place of just utter despair, right? Because that really becomes, we see this in the 12 steps as well. It's that incomprehensible demoralization, right, is sort of that bottom, and
Right.
from there there's growth, and it's almost like a seedling starts within the dark, dank soil,
Mhm.
as painful as that is, right? It's sort of like a spiritual death. And I think that, I mean, the shadow is, I mean, it's the shadow, so it's hard to see.
Mhm.
And I think that confronting the shadow, I think the 12 steps, for example, this is my experience, is they're very useful in allowing and kind of showing one where to look for the shadow, right?
Mhm.
And Jung
Yeah.
says this too, that we start by examining our own selfishness, and that if we can sort of get a grasp on where we act selfishly, then we're starting to kind of get a handle on where the shadow is, what its characteristics are. um because nobody likes to admit that they're selfish, that's like the last thing any of us want to admit, and yet
Mhm.
each of us is selfish to the core. Every individual cell in our bodies could be seen as selfish. It's just this trying to survive and make it in a brutal world. So
Right.
as we can examine our selfishness, we begin to kind of get a sense of maybe those things that are taking place in the unconscious that drive us to kind of behave in these certain ways. Bill Wilson, who was the author of the book Alcoholics Anonymous and who authored the
Mm-hmm.
12 Steps,
Yeah.
he said that selfishness is really like Jung, that it's the first step towards uncovering and discovering what makes us tick. And so I do find it interesting that um, in these methods, the Jungian and the one with the 12 steps, is that the first thing we're really told to do is to look at our selfishness. And that's how we make the shadow conscious. So step one says that we admitted we were powerless over drugs or alcohol or whatever, and that our lives had become unmanageable. And even that in itself is a step towards making the shadow conscious. I think the defining characteristic of alcoholism, for example, is that it sort of exists below the surface. So like I might be an alcoholic, but I'm also the last person in my life to know it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody else around me can see it, and they've been telling me for years or whatever, and yet I can't see it myself, right? Until that one day when something happens where I finally wake up to it, and then boom, so I've made part of the shadow conscious. I've admitted to my innermost self that I'm a drug addict, for example. So it's sort of becoming aware of these things that drive us, and it's so difficult to see. It really is. I mean, I know for me, like in my relationship with my wife, for example, she might say one little thing and not mean it to be anything. But
Right.
but I take it personally, and then all of a sudden I'm telling myself the old story of, oh, she must be mad at me. What did I do? And so even that, like in those daily interactions, the shadow's very present. um
Mm-hmm.
and it's coming to see that and to recognize that is really uh one of the most important things we can do for our own kind of well-being and healing, I think.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, awareness is everything. And, I was just talking to a guest last week, awareness, it all starts with awareness. If you can be aware of what's going on, I talk to my daughter a lot, when she's saying someone at school is not being kind. I'm like, it's not about you. There's something going on with them, with that maybe you triggered something, but if someone is being very unkind, like there's something going on, and I do that with myself when I'm being very reactive, and I'm maybe I lash out on my husband, and I really and I'm able to do this now. I'm able to step back and be like, "What was that all about?" And then it all comes, I'm able to dip into my subconscious very easily now with all the work that I've done with my own healing. Um, but it is very true, like, we have our own stuff that's happening within us, and it's so important to be able s to see that see the awareness there, and I think it really starts with that, and then being present, like you were saying, um,
Mhm.
because, yeah, we could easily get lost in our
Yeah,
thoughts and in our old and the narratives, because for me, there were narratives that were going on and on and on for years and years and years, and so having to kind of peel back and peel that all away, it takes a lot of work.
it sure does. It sure does. There's James Hollis, who's a great he's an author and a speaker. He's a Jungian analyst. He says that if you really want to kind of confront your shadow, you could just ask your spouse, what are those things that I do that I can't see that drive you crazy? And that if we can, it is funny, right? But if we can do it with like actually and be open to it and be open
Yeah.
minded, like as painful as it is, we would get a lot of information about sort of what those parts of us that we can't see. um, I find it very fascinating that I always have to wonder, like, is it me? Like, are we, like, we're having this dynamic right now, and my brain says, oh, it's all you. It's you're the problem here. Like, if you would just change the way you're behaving, then I wouldn't be
Mm,
upset, right? But then it's like, if there was a mirror or like a video camera taking, recording this whole incident, and I watched it later on, how much of it would I be surprised to see that I actually was the cause of?
yeah.
And that's the shadow. So
Yeah. Yeah. And then that's interesting that you say that because my husband, we've done a lot of work, together and communicating and he can tell me the things that bother him and then I can easily go back and think, okay, where is that taking me to? Is this taking me to my childhood and how I felt, when my dad or my mom or some authority was talking to me and it was very triggering and that's kind of how we really grow from I feel like whenever we hit a challenging point in our life, um, or just day-to-day lives, it's we're able to kind of communicate that and really grow from it, and I think that's when you're healing, when you're because growth is can be painful. That's why they call them growing pains, right? There's a
yeah.
lot of pain in growth. And but it's good. It's so good to get to that point.
Mhm.
Um, and then it becomes easier because then, I can address all of the ugly things about myself that I don't like. And I do it all the time now.
Yeah.
In my day-to-day life. Um, so for you, I can only assume writing this book was extremely therapeutic for you and your own healing.
Yeah. It sure was. It
Mm.
sure was. I mean, um, it really, the book was, um, it's not a book about my story. Although, I mean, I'm in there, but I don't really tell my story. I actually tell somebody else's story. Um, and but the healing aspect of the book has really come, um, in the fact that, I'm not a Jungian. I don't have a college degree. I have an associate's degree, but that the Jungian community, has really kind of accepted the book, and they're very excited about it. Some of the other authors have mentioned it, and they wrote me blurbs. And so there seems to be, because one of my shadow, little elements, I guess, is that I've always wanted people to think I'm smart, and to sort of, so I've looked for kind of validation through that, and so it's been interesting to sort of get that validation, right, through
Mm,
this way, and to try to be accepting of what people are saying, and be accepting of the fact that I've wanted this validation, and now I'm sort of seeking it. I think it's a kind of a paradox that, there's been this itch that I've wanted scratched, and now it's being scratched, right? And then
mhm,
to see the sort of the pitfalls in that, is, to see that it's like, okay, so if I get this validation, then what, right? Like, what's
right.
next, right? What, like, my therapist said to me, uh and it stuck with me. She said, Cody, how many blurbs will be enough blurbs? you know
Mhm.
and it's this fascinating journey, right, as we peel these layers back, and we, um just discover more and more. There's just always more work to be done. So
Always more work to be done. Yes. Right. You're right. Wow. Well, is there anything you'd like to add?
um well, yeah, I would like to add that if you're interested in checking out the book, you can find it at my website. It's cody-peterson.com. You can contact me there. I'm happy to respond to all the emails that I get. I want to take this journey with others. And I try to do what I can to help people along the way. And also, I appreciate the work that people like you do, that you specifically. There's a great community of podcasters that are all about healing and helping and showing the love. And I appreciate that. That, like, I'm glad that the world has a lot of people who are trying to get on the path and who are on the path. I just think it's wonderful. So thanks
Oh,
for
well,
having me on.
thank you. I really appreciate you coming on and chatting with me, and this was great. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
That was Cody Peterson, author of The Shadow of a Figure of Light, The Archetype of the Alcoholic, and The Journey to Enlightenment. For more information on Cody, please go to the show notes. November's issue of Authentic Insider is out. Check out Authentic Insider at traumasurvivorthriver.com. That's traumasurvivorthriver.com. You can also find episodes of a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my email list. You can get Authentic Insider magazine in your inbox monthly. We will be taking a break until after the holidays, so we will see you in January. You've been listening to a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast on Mental Health News Radio Network. I'm Lorilee Binstock. Thank you so much for being a part of the conversation. Take care.